New York City in the 1930s was a kingdom built on contradictions. Neon lights washed over darkened alleys, jazz music drifted through the night like perfume, and polished shoes clicked across sidewalks that hid more blood than anyone dared to imagine. The city felt alive, too alive, as if its heartbeat pulsed beneath the pavement, echoing through the tunnels, docks, and speakeasies that fed its restless soul. To most Americans, New York was the capital of opportunity. But beneath the glow of Broadway, another city existed. A hidden world. A world carved out in whispers, shadows, and silent wars that were never written in the papers. And at the center of that world stood a man who didn't look like a king, yet ruled like one. Charles Lucky Luciano. Suave, calculating, soft-spoken. His power didn't come from brute force but from vision. From understanding the unspoken rules of power long before anyone else realized they even existed. Luciano didn't seek control of New York streets just to dominate them. He sought to re-engineer the entire underworld, to pull order out of chaos, to turn scattered gangs into something that resembled a corporation. But while the public watched the flashy violence of the era, drive-by shootings, assassinations, and turf wars, the real conflicts were quieter, more patient, and infinitely more dangerous. These were the battles New York never saw. The newspapers printed stories of sensational murders, but they didn't see the meetings in dimly lit back rooms where alliances were forged with nothing but a nod. They didn't hear the coded telephone calls, the silk-soft threats woven into casual conversation, the promises that sounded like gifts but carried the weight of death. This was the battlefield Luciano mastered, the battlefield of influence. He understood that true power wasn't about who fired the gun. It was about who gave permission for the bullet to fly. As the Great Depression tightened its grip on the city, desperation fed corruption like dry wood feeds a fire. Politicians needed votes. Businesses needed protection. Dockworkers needed jobs. And everyone needed money. Luciano recognized this hunger and transformed it into opportunity. Every desperate soul, every frightened worker, every struggling official, each one was a potential piece on his invisible chessboard. He didn't have to move all the pieces himself. He just had to create the game. But New York was never simple. It was a city layered with secrets. Immigrants brought traditions of honor and vendetta. Street kids learned early that loyalty could be more valuable than bread. Every block carried the ghost of someone who had fought, loved, cheated, or died for control. Luciano had grown up within this world, shaped by its brutality and its beauty, and he understood its psychology better than anyone. He knew that fear alone couldn't sustain power. Fear forced obedience, but admiration created devotion. And what Luciano built was not just an empire, it was a myth. The myth of a man who could stop wars with a glance, who could speak to gangsters and senators with the same calm authority, who understood human nature down to its bones. The city felt that myth. Even those who had never seen him felt his presence like a shift in temperature. When a speakeasy stopped paying protection, they paid again within a week, without a single threat spoken aloud. When rival gangs argued over territory, they sought his judgment. When businessmen worried about unions, they called his name. All of this power, all of this influence, existed in the shadows, invisible yet undeniable. New York moved to the rhythm of Luciano's decisions, even when the public believed they were witnessing a natural order of crime and consequence. But beneath the calm surface of Luciano's empire, tension simmered. The police, pushed by ambitious politicians, wanted a victory. Rival mobsters plotted, waiting for the perfect moment of weakness. Newspapers sensationalized every crime to sell copies, unknowingly fueling paranoia and rage. Luciano was waging not one war but many, each hidden behind smiles, handshakes, and well-dressed men who seemed more like businessmen than criminals. These were wars of manipulation, of influence, of timing. Wars fought not with armies but with whispers. The kind of wars that left no bodies on the sidewalk, yet reshaped the entire structure of the city. New York never saw these battles because they were never meant to be visible. Luciano understood that visibility was vulnerability. The moment a king reveals his throne, enemies aim for the crown. So he ruled in silence. He built networks so deep that even he didn't have to give orders directly. His power flowed like electricity through wires no one else could see. If a smuggler disappeared, if a rival fell from grace, if a cop suddenly changed sides, it was all part of the invisible war machine he constructed. And yet, for all his control, a storm was building. A storm that would come from unexpected places. Inside his own circle, inside government offices, inside the very public he manipulated so well. Luciano believed he could outthink his enemies, that he could stay one step ahead. But the same shadows that hid his power also hid his downfall. For now, though, the city still belonged to him. The skyline stretched upward like the bars of a giant cage, glittering, humming, breathing. It was a kingdom built on fear, loyalty, ambition, and silence. A kingdom where the most important stories were never told. This is the story of Lucky Luciano's Shadow War. The battles the newspapers never printed. The decisions that shaped the underworld without anyone knowing. And the man who learned to fight without ever lifting a gun. Before Lucky Luciano rose to power, New York City's underworld was a chaotic organism. Alive, unpredictable, and constantly tearing itself apart. It was a world without structure, without rules, without any true authority capable of containing the violence that erupted nightly in its streets. In the early 1900s, the immigrant neighborhoods of Manhattan and Brooklyn were battlegrounds, carved up by gangs that operated more like tribal factions than criminal enterprises. These men weren't businessmen, strategists, or visionaries. They were survivors. Fighters. Wolves protecting scraps of territory, scraps of money, scraps of respect. To understand Luciano's transformation of the Mafia, one must first understand the disorder he inherited. The city's criminal landscape was a fractured mirror, each shard representing a different ethnic group fighting for dominance. The Italians terrorized their own enclaves with the Black Hand, extorting terrified shopkeepers with crudely written threats signed with a dripping black palm. Jewish gangs, hardened by poverty and discrimination, fought fiercely for control of the Lower East Side. Irish toughs held the docks, drinking whiskey by day and cracking skulls by night. No one trusted anyone. No one collaborated. No one thought beyond tomorrow. New York before Luciano was a place where alliances were temporary and betrayal was expected. Men shook hands while planning assassinations. They shared cigarettes with the same men they intended to rob later that night. Every gathering could erupt into violence. Every street corner could be the site of a sudden execution. It was a world ruled by emotion, anger, pride, vengeance, not by strategy. Blood feuds lasted years, sometimes decades, passed down through generations like cursed inheritances. Within the Italian underworld itself, the divisions ran even deeper. Sicily, Naples, Calabria, each region brought its own traditions, its own grudges, its own sense of superiority. These rivalries didn't disappear in America, they intensified. Without a unifying structure, the early Mafia evolved into a series of loosely connected clans, each led by a local tyrant who demanded loyalty through fear. These men resisted change, resisted outsiders, resisted anything that threatened their absolute control. It was a dangerous environment for anyone with ambition. It was an even more dangerous environment for anyone who dared to think differently. Violence wasn't just common, it was constant. Murders became a form of communication. A warning. A declaration of war. A method of negotiation. Bodies were found stuffed into barrels, floating in rivers, slumped behind tenements. By 1910, the city was drowning in the blood of gangland killings, and newspapers seized the hysteria to sell papers. Headlines screamed of Black Hand terror, of Italian assassins lurking in alleyways, of Jewish gangsters shooting it out with police. But what the papers didn't show was the deeper truth. The violence was the symptom, not the disease. The real sickness was the power vacuum beneath it all. The police were no saviors. They were outmatched, underpaid, and often corrupt. Many officers served as muscle for hire, taking bribes to look the other way while gangs settled their own disputes. Others acted as unofficial enforcers, beating suspects until confessions were extracted, guilty or not. The justice system was a patchwork of political favors, backdoor deals, and courtroom negotiations where truth mattered far less than influence. Criminals thrived in the cracks of this broken system. They fed on it, adapted to it, weaponized it. And then came Prohibition, America's grand social experiment, and the gasoline poured over New York's criminal fire. When alcohol became illegal, the criminals of the city saw opportunity. Enormous opportunity. But without structure, the opportunity became chaos. Rival gangs hijacked each other's trucks, raided each other's breweries, kidnapped each other's drivers. Gunfire echoed across Manhattan every night. Speakeasies were blown apart. Armored cars rumbled through the streets. The profits were enormous, but so were the risks. Every gang wanted more. Every leader feared losing control. Every ambitious young criminal believed he could take the throne, any throne. It was during this era of instability that Joe, the boss Masuria, and Salvatore Maranzano emerged as two competing giants within the Italian Mafia. Both men clung to tradition. Both demanded unwavering obedience. Both hated each other with a passion that threatened to engulf the entire underworld. Their feud ignited the Castellamarese War, a bloody, drawn-out conflict that turned Little Italy into a battlefield. Men were shot in broad daylight. Businesses were burned to the ground. Families lived in fear of the next explosion or the next quiet knock on the door. The war wasn't about money. It wasn't even about territory. It was about pride. Ego. An outdated belief that the Mafia should remain locked in the old ways of Sicily, where a don ruled like a feudal lord and everyone bowed to him without question. To these traditionalists, collaboration was weakness. Innovation was betrayal. The idea of running the Mafia like a modern organization was unthinkable. And yet, beneath the surface something was changing. A new generation of gangsters had grown up in America. They had learned English, mingled with other ethnic groups, and understood the business opportunities of the modern world. They saw the old Mafia as a relic, a dinosaur gasping its last breaths. They wanted structure, not superstition. Profit, not pride. Expansion, not isolation. The underworld was primed for evolution. It was an ecosystem on the brink, waiting for someone to impose order. Someone who could speak the language of the streets yet think like a strategist. Someone who understood both the brutality of the past and the possibilities of the future. Before Luciano, New York's criminal world was a storm, loud, violent, and aimless. Every gang was a lightning bolt, striking without warning, lighting up the city for a moment before fading back into darkness. There was no conductor. No blueprint. No grand design. Just reaction. Just survival. Luciano saw opportunity where others saw chaos. He recognized that the scattered pieces of the underworld could be assembled into something far stronger than their individual parts. But to do that, he would need to dismantle the old powers, silence the loudest guns, and unify the most dangerous men alive. Before he could build an empire, he had to conquer the ruins of the one that came before. Salvatore Lucania was not born into power. He was born into struggle, into a life defined by scarcity, noise, and the relentless pressure of survival. When his family left Lercora in Sicily in 1906, they were escaping hunger, searching for the faintest trace of opportunity in America. What they found instead was Manhattan's Lower East Side, a crowded world of pushcarts, sweatshops, and tenement buildings that leaned so close together they seemed to whisper secrets to each other through the night. The air smelled of coal smoke, laundry water, and stale bread. Children played in the streets not because they wanted to, but because their cramped apartments left them nowhere else to exist. Young Salvatore, barely 9 years old, quickly learned that the streets were classrooms of their own. They taught lessons that school never could: how to run fast, how to keep your mouth shut, how to fight for what was yours, and how to swallow fear before it swallowed you. The immigrant boys spoke a dozen different languages, but the real dialect was survival. Fights broke out over marbles, bread, turf, and pride. Every alleyway became a battlefield, every rooftop a refuge, every friend a potential enemy. Salvatore absorbed it all. He observed the older boys, their swagger, their confidence, their absolute command of the block. He realized that in this world, strength was currency, and weakness was an invitation. His first taste of power came from necessity. Bullies targeted him for being small, foreign, and new. They called him names, pushed him around, stole the few coins he carried. But humiliation had a way of crystallizing something sharp inside him. He refused to remain a victim. He made friends, formed alliances, and learned to protect himself. By 10 years old, he had already fought more street battles than most grown men. His fists hardened, his instincts sharpened, and his resolve deepened. Each punch he threw was not an act of violence, it was an act of self-definition. But even in those early years, Salvatore possessed a trait few others had: ambition. He didn't just want to survive the streets, he wanted to rule them. While other boys dreamed of food, jobs, or escaping poverty, he dreamed of influence, of being the person others feared, respected, or depended on. The Lower East Side began to feel too small for his imagination. Every insult, every bruise, every stolen nickel added fuel to the fire burning inside him. School held no interest for him. The strict teachers, the crowded classrooms, the endless lectures, all of it felt irrelevant to the reality he lived. He dropped out by 14, choosing the streets over textbooks. He understood that real power was learned outside, not inside. And the streets welcomed him back like an old friend. His first steps into crime were small: running errands for older boys, delivering messages, acting as a lookout. He learned how to blend into the background, how to listen without being noticed, how to read a man's intentions by the way he lit a cigarette or folded his arms. These were the skills that would later define him. By 15 he graduated to gambling rings, protection schemes, and petty theft. The risk excited him, but more importantly, it brought him something he had never truly felt before: control. It was around this time that he earned his infamous nickname. Local kids teased him for being scrawny, for having holes in his shoes, for speaking English with an accent. One day he confronted them, not with anger but with unexpected courage. He told them, "Call me Lucky. Because I'm going to be." The name stuck. Whether he meant it as a joke or a prophecy, it became a symbol of who he intended to become. Later the public would create myths about how he got the name: narrow escapes, miraculous survival, but the truth was simpler: he chose it for himself. He declared his destiny out loud. As he grew older, the city's underground began to reveal itself to him like a vast, intricate puzzle. He watched as Italian extortionists preyed on their own communities through Black-Hand threats. He observed how Jewish gangs operated with intelligence and coordination. He saw how Irish dockworkers controlled entire sections of the waterfront with brute force and loyalty. Each group had something to teach him. Each had strengths and weaknesses he filed away in his mind. He was not just learning how to survive crime, he was learning how to understand it. By 16, Lucky had joined Meyer Lansky's circle, a group of street-smart Jewish kids with the same hunger he carried. Lansky, quiet and analytical, saw something in Lucky that others missed: the ability to lead. Together with Bugsy Siegel, they formed a trio that mixed brains, charisma and violence in a way the city had rarely seen. They weren't just gang members, they were innovators. They imagined crime as something bigger, something organized, something efficient. The turning point in Lucky's life came when he realized that the older Italian mob bosses had no vision beyond their own pride. They ruled through fear, demanded loyalty through blood, and refused to adapt to the rapidly changing landscape of American crime. Lucky felt suffocated by their narrow thinking. He wanted to work with Jews, Irish, anyone who shared his ambition. The old Mafia forbade it. Lucky ignored them. In that defiance, a new idea began to take shape. An idea that crime could be structured, modernized, unified. But before he could reshape the underworld, he had to prove himself. His rise was not smooth, it was soaked in danger. He survived kidnappings, beatings, and assassination attempts. One brutal attack left scars that would mark him for life, reminders of the violence that shadowed every step he took. Yet with every wound, his reputation grew. He became known not just for his cunning but for his resilience. He survived things that would have killed lesser men. He made the impossible seem inevitable. Luck was part of it, yes. But skill played a greater role. He knew who to trust, when to strike, when to speak, and, more importantly, when to stay silent. He didn't crave attention, he craved influence. While others competed for fame on the streets, he built connections behind closed doors. He played the long game. By his early 20s, Salvatore Lucania was no longer just a street kid. He was Lucky Luciano, a rising force with alliances that spanned ethnic lines, a mind shaped by hardship, and a vision shaped by ambition. He had learned that the world didn't give power, it had to be taken, piece by piece, decision by decision, risk by risk. And soon, the city that once bullied him would kneel to the empire he was destined to build. By the time Lucky Luciano entered his mid-20s, the chaos of New York's underworld had become intolerable to him. Every day brought new killings, new betrayals, new whispers of war between bosses who clung to tradition like drowning men grasping at driftwood. The Mafia was powerful, yes, but it was fractured, broken into pieces that refused to fit together. To Lucky this made no sense. Crime was business. Business required structure. And structure required leadership. Not the outdated, feudal sort of leadership the old dons embraced, but something more modern, more flexible, more American. Lucky saw the underworld the way a young architect sees a half-collapsed building. Not as something doomed to crumble, but as something that could be rebuilt into something far grander. The question was how. How do you take a volatile army of killers, smugglers, thieves and bootleggers and convince them to think like businessmen? How do you persuade men defined by ego and vengeance to submit to order? How do you build an empire out of the ashes of 1,000 street wars? The answer began with alliances. Alliances that defied tradition and shocked the old generation. Meyer Lansky became Lucky's closest strategist, a quiet mind with a genius for numbers, risk and long-term planning. Bugsy Siegel brought the fire, the aggression, the raw force needed to intimidate anyone who refused to cooperate. Frank Costello handled the political side, bribing officials, buying influence, making sure the wheels of government turned in their favor. No Mafia boss before Luciano had ever created such a diverse network of talents. Most wouldn't have dared. But Lucky didn't see ethnicity or background, he saw capability. To him, the only true value was effectiveness. This new way of thinking put him on a collision course with the old Mafia leadership. Joe, the boss Masuria, believed he owned the streets of Manhattan, and Salvatore Maranzano believed he was the rightful ruler of every Italian criminal in America. They treated Lucky like a gifted but disobedient child. Their arrogance only hardened his resolve. He listened to their orders, nodded respectfully, then went behind their backs to negotiate deals they would never understand. He was building something they could not see, a structure that would outlast every one of them. The Castellamarese war erupted like a storm, but Lucky saw it as an opportunity. While Masuria and Maranzano fought over pride, Lucky waged his own quiet campaign. He built relationships with the men beneath the bosses, captains, soldiers, union organizers, smugglers, men who handled real business, men tired of pointless murders ordered by leaders who had no vision. Lucky spoke to them in private, appealing not to their fear but to their ambition. He promised stability, profit, peace. He promised a future. He didn't ask them to betray their bosses. He simply asked them to imagine something better. And slowly, quietly, the underworld began shifting its loyalty. In 1931, Luciano made his move. Masuria was eliminated first, taken out in a quiet Coney Island restaurant after Lucky excused himself to the bathroom, leaving the old Don's assassins none the wiser. It was a calculated betrayal, but to Lucky it was a strategic correction. Maranzano was next, cut down in his Manhattan office by hitmen disguised as federal agents. With those two towering figures gone, the entire landscape of the Mafia changed overnight. For the first time, there was no single tyrant demanding absolute obedience. There was a void where power had lived, and Lucky filled it. But he didn't crown himself king, not openly. Instead, he constructed a new system, the Commission. A governing body of family bosses who met, discussed major decisions, settled disputes, and controlled the direction of organized crime across the country. It was revolutionary. No more feudal hierarchy. No more solitary kings. No more destructive wars born from pride and ego. In Lucky's world, cooperation replaced domination. Votes replaced vendettas. Structure replaced chaos. The 5 New York families, Luciano, Mangano, Bonanno, Prophesai, and Gagliano, became the backbone of this new order. Each had autonomy in their own territory, but major decisions required agreement. Lucky positioned himself not as ruler, but as facilitator, mediator, and strategist. He was the unofficial leader, the architect of peace, the man everyone trusted to maintain balance. This system transformed the Mafia into a modern corporation. It formalized rules, restricted unnecessary killings, and opened doors to national expansion. Across the country, organized crime groups in Chicago, Cleveland, Buffalo, Detroit, and beyond recognized Luciano's commission as the new authority. They didn't see him as a dictator, they saw him as the man who had finally brought logic to an illogical world. With structure came profit. Bootlegging was booming. Illegal gambling rings expanded. Union infiltration became efficient and controlled. Money flowed with the smoothness of a well-oiled machine. And in the center of this machine stood Lucky Luciano, operating with the calm precision of a businessman. His suits were tailored, his voice soft, his manner polite. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to threaten. His power was quiet, invisible, and absolute. But Luciano's genius wasn't just organizational, it was psychological. He understood people in ways the old Dons never did. He knew how to draw loyalty without demanding it. He knew how to create fear without showing it. He didn't rule with brutality alone, though he was capable of violence when necessary. His true weapon was understanding. He recognized that every man in the underworld wanted something. Money, respect, protection, influence. Lucky offered each man exactly what he craved. And in return he gained an empire. He also understood timing. He rarely reacted impulsively. He waited, watched, gathered information, and struck only when the outcome was assured. This patience made him dangerous. It made him predictable to no one, yet reliable to everyone. Under his leadership, the Mafia became something America had never seen. A national network of criminal enterprises coordinated with the discipline of a Fortune 500 company. Truck routes, casinos, brothels, union votes, numbers rackets. Everything was monitored, calculated, and approved. Money was tracked. Territory was mapped. Disputes were mediated before they exploded into violence. To the outside world, chaos seemed to fade. The newspapers reported fewer mob wars. The streets felt calmer. But beneath the surface, Luciano's invisible empire hummed like a well-tuned engine. For the first time in the history of American organized crime, there was order. And with order came power, more power than any single man had ever held before. Lucky Luciano didn't just lead the Mafia, he redesigned it. He reshaped it. He revolutionized it. He took a fragmented collection of desperate men and forged them into a formidable, unified force. But Luciano's rise came with consequences. The more structure he built, the more attention he attracted from politicians, prosecutors, and rivals. Stability brought prosperity, but prosperity brought scrutiny. And scrutiny would eventually bring danger. For now, though, he stood at the peak of his creation, an empire built not on superstition but on strategy. Not on fear alone but on understanding. Not on the traditions of the old world, but on the vision of a man who believed crime could be refined, organized, and elevated to something unprecedented. Lucky Luciano had built the modern American Mafia. And the world would never be the same. The code of Omerta was older than Luciano, older than New York, older even than the Mafia itself. It had been carried across the ocean like an heirloom, etched into the minds of men who came from places where the law could not be trusted, where justice was bought, and where silence was the only shield a person had. To outsiders, Omerta was a quaint relic of Sicilian tradition. To the men of the underworld it was sacred scripture. It was the invisible thread that kept everything from unraveling. And for Lucky Luciano, Omerta was more than a rule, it was a psychological weapon. Silence in Luciano's world was power. It created mystery, fear, loyalty, and control. It separated the initiated from the outsiders. It made the Mafia feel less like a criminal organization and more like a brotherhood, a secret society bound by a loyalty deeper than blood. But Luciano didn't enforce Omerta blindly. He understood its psychological roots. He understood why men obeyed it. And he manipulated those reasons with the precision of a scholar dissecting the human soul. Omerta began as a survival mechanism. Immigrants arriving in America discovered quickly that the authorities weren't on their side. Police harassed them, judges ignored them, and politicians took their money without providing protection. In such a world, talking to the law was not just betrayal, it was suicide. The community handled its own problems, and silence became the only language that mattered. Luciano, who had grown up watching families threatened by black-hand extortionists, understood the power that fear held over a neighborhood. But as he gained influence, he transformed fear into something more sophisticated. Silence wasn't just about avoiding the police. It was about maintaining unity, preventing chaos, and protecting the structure he had built. The Mafia thrived on secrecy. The less people knew, the less they could betray. But Lucky didn't enforce Omerta like the old Dons did. They relied purely on intimidation, on the threat of death for anyone who broke the code. Luciano realized fear could only go so far. A man terrified of dying today might talk tomorrow if he saw no future. So Lucky created a different kind of loyalty, one built on opportunity. Under his reign, men didn't stay silent because they feared punishment. They stayed silent because they believed in the system. They believed in the money it brought them, the status it gave them, the sense of belonging it offered. Omerta became a psychological contract. You protect the family. The family protects you. This simple equation reshaped the way the Mafia operated. Lucky made sure that his men were taken care of. If a soldier went to prison, his family received money. If a man died on business, his children were fed. If someone got sick, the family paid their bills. Under Luciano, Omerta had benefits. It wasn't just sacrifice, it was investment. Breaking it wasn't just betrayal, it was foolishness. Still, silence could not exist without fear. And Lucky was no stranger to enforcing the darker side of the code. Men who talked disappeared. Informants were dealt with swiftly. But the punishment wasn't theatrical. Luciano disliked messy violence. He believed killing was a necessity, not a spectacle. A man who broke Omerta vanished quietly, another ghost absorbed by the city's shadows. The message spread without words, without threats, without need for explanation. Silence created its own language. Omerta also shaped the psychological landscape within the Mafia. It created a culture where men spoke in metaphors, where instructions were implied rather than said, where the most important business was handled with nods rather than signatures. This made Luciano's organization uniquely resilient. Even if a man was captured, there was nothing to confess. He didn't know the full chain of command. He didn't know long-term plans. He knew only his role, his orders, and the consequences of disobedience. This compartmentalization was one of Luciano's most brilliant innovations. The old Mafia bosses wanted to know everything, to micromanage every operation. Lucky believed knowledge was a liability. The fewer people who knew the truth, the safer everyone was. Omerta became the backbone of this system, ensuring that secrecy wasn't just cultural, it was structural. Yet the code didn't only affect the men inside the Mafia. It extended outward into the neighborhoods that surrounded them. Shopkeepers, dockworkers, bar owners, they all learned not to talk. Not because they were criminals but because they understood the balance of power. Speaking to the police invited retaliation. Staying silent earned protection. The Mafia became a shadow government, delivering justice in its own brutal way. And Omerta functioned as its unwritten constitution. Still, the psychological weight of silence took its toll. Many men lived in a constant state of tension, trapped between loyalty and survival, between fear and pride. Their lives were defined by secrets they could never reveal, by deeds they could never confess. And Luciano understood this burden better than anyone. He knew the cost of loyalty. He knew the paranoia that lived in every soldier's mind. He knew that silence could protect, but it could also isolate. This is why he created a sense of family within the Mafia. Dinners, celebrations, rituals, these were more than traditions. They were psychological scaffolding. They reminded every man that he belonged, that he mattered, that he was part of something larger than himself. The warmth of brotherhood softened the harshness of Omerta, making the silence bearable. And yet, even as he strengthened the code, Luciano also redefined its limits. He rejected the old Sicilian belief that the Mafia should be an insular, ethnic-only institution. Omerta remained, but the prejudice beneath it faded. Under Lucky, the American Mafia became less about heritage and more about efficiency. Silence wasn't tied to bloodlines anymore, it was tied to business. Luciano took an ancient concept and reshaped it for a modern world. He understood that silence wasn't the absence of sound, it was the presence of control. Omerta wasn't about secrecy, it was about unity. And unity was the foundation of power. In the underworld Lucky Luciano engineered, words were weapons and silence was armor. The code of Omerta wasn't simply a rule. It was the heartbeat of his empire, a beat that pulsed quietly beneath the surface of New York, holding his world together with the strength of 1,000 unspoken promises. By the early 1930s, Lucky Luciano no longer saw crime as a desperate scramble for money. He saw it as a business, one as complex, demanding, and profitable as any corporation on Wall Street. Where others saw bootleg liquor and smoky backrooms, Luciano saw supply chains, distribution networks, logistics, management hierarchies, and market opportunities. His genius was not in inventing these criminal trades, but in refining them, organizing them, scaling them beyond anything the underworld had ever imagined. Under Luciano, crime became an enterprise. Prohibition had opened the door. Bootlegging was the foundation, the engine that fueled countless fortunes. But the old bosses ran their operations like backyard breweries, sloppy, unreliable, constantly exposed to hijacking and police raids. Lucky changed that. He established transportation routes across states, secured deals with Canadian distillers, and put trusted men in charge of every step, from production to delivery. Drivers were paid well. Guards were armed and disciplined. Bars and speakeasies received shipments on time, every time. Where chaos had once reigned, efficiency took over. It was crime with a business plan. But liquor was only the beginning. Gambling, long a scattered network of small-time bookmakers and rigged games, became a coordinated nationwide venture. Luciano understood the psychology of gamblers, their desires, their weaknesses, their illusions of control. He opened casinos and betting parlors that operated with the sleekness of legitimate establishments. The games were fixed enough to profit but fair enough to keep customers returning. Money poured in from every corner of the city, flowing upstream into the pockets of men who never touched a card or dice. Then came prostitution, an industry the old Mafia treated as dirty, shameful, and unworthy of serious attention. Luciano disagreed. He saw it as a predictable source of revenue if managed correctly. He professionalized brothels, enforced standards, reduced violence, and ensured that the women, while exploited, were treated better under his organization than under their previous pimps. The police were bribed, the judges greased, and the city's vice districts hummed with controlled profitability. To the public he was the king of sin. To his associates he was a visionary who had unlocked an enormous, untapped market. The unions were next. This was where Luciano's business instincts reached their peak. Labor organizations controlled ports, trucking routes, construction sites, and factories, the arteries through which the economy flowed. Controlling these unions meant controlling New York's financial bloodstream. Lucky placed his men inside union leadership, manipulated votes, and turned strikes into negotiations where he was always the silent beneficiary. Dockworkers unloaded only the shipments he approved. Truckers transported goods only through routes he controlled. Even legitimate businesses unknowingly relied on his influence to function. But Luciano didn't only exploit the unions, he protected them. If a company pushed back, trucks mysteriously vanished. Machinery broke. Workers refused to show up. Then, miraculously, the problems would disappear once the company agreed to certain terms. The businessmen understood the game. It was extortion disguised as cooperation, and Luciano perfected it. His financial systems became increasingly sophisticated. Money laundering, once a crude process of hiding cash in restaurants or barbershops, evolved into a network of investments in nightclubs, construction companies, trucking firms, and even legitimate real estate. Lucky knew that the safest money was money that looked clean. He operated quietly, avoiding flashy displays of wealth. He didn't need the public to see him as a king. He needed bankers and politicians to see him as a respectable man with respectable interests. This dual life, the criminal mastermind and the polished businessman, became one of Luciano's greatest strengths. He attended Broadway shows, had dinner in upscale clubs, shook hands with elite businessmen and judges, all while orchestrating illegal operations that stretched across the country. While other gangsters flaunted their money with noisy clubs and gold-plated rings, Lucky blended into high society like a shadow among silk curtains. The structure of his empire was unlike anything seen before in organized crime. Each business, liquor, gambling, prostitution, unions, narcotics, operated like a department within a corporation. Each department had a manager, a clear chain of command, and standardized rules. Reports circulated upward. Disputes were handled calmly. Profits were calculated, divided, and reinvested. Lucky even implemented a system to bail out lower-level workers caught by the police, ensuring their loyalty in silence. He treated his criminal empire with the same seriousness and precision as a CEO treats a multinational company. The old bosses laughed at this approach. They called him too American, too modern, too focused on paperwork and meetings. What they failed to see was that the future belonged to structure, not superstition. Narcotics, the most dangerous and profitable of all trades, became another pillar of Luciano's empire. He didn't flaunt it. He didn't talk about it. But he oversaw a distribution network that stretched from Europe to New York. Smugglers, sailors, corrupt officials, they all played a role. Heroin traveled in hidden compartments of suitcases, in hollowed-out furniture, in crates labeled as machine parts. The profits dwarfed those of liquor. But so did the risks. Luciano took them anyway, calculating that the reward outweighed the danger. He believed he could outsmart law enforcement forever. He wasn't entirely wrong. For a time, his enterprise seemed untouchable. Politicians protected him because he protected their careers. Police captains received envelopes that made them forget the raids they were supposed to conduct. Judges owed favors. Newspapers printed stories fed to them by Luciano's men. The city functioned like a stage play where Luciano controlled the lighting, the script, and the actors. Money flowed through his empire like electricity, powering every corner of the underworld. It moved silently, invisibly, from betting parlors to banks, from brothels to politicians' pockets, from docks to warehouses. And through each transaction, Luciano's influence grew stronger. But with expansion came pressure. The bigger the enterprise became, the more attention it drew. Rivals envied him. The government began to feel embarrassed by its own inability to rein him in. Moral crusaders saw him as the figurehead of America's moral decline. And District Attorney Thomas Dewey, ambitious and unyielding, began to see Luciano not as a man, but as a target, an opportunity for fame and political gain. For now, though, Lucky remained in control. His empire stood tall, carefully balanced, cunningly constructed. Crime had evolved from street-level violence into a complex industry, and he was the mastermind behind it. Lucky Luciano didn't just profit from the business of crime. He built the business model itself. And every criminal organization that followed would use his blueprint, whether they realized it or not. Power is never held alone. It is surrounded, propped up by allies, threatened by rivals, stalked by opportunists who watch from the shadows, waiting for the moment when even the strongest man blinks. For Lucky Luciano, the ascent to power was never a straight line. It was a maze of alliances and betrayals, a delicate dance between trust and paranoia. Every handshake carried weight. Every smile hid calculation. And every man in his orbit had the potential to be a friend, an enemy, or a temporary companion who could shift roles in an instant. Lucky knew early that the underworld was not built on loyalty, but on mutually beneficial arrangements. Men stayed loyal only as long as they profited. Respect was conditional. Fear was fragile. It wasn't enough to be feared. One had to be needed. One had to be useful. And so Luciano shaped his world with this understanding, carefully choosing who stood beside him and who would fall under his shadow. At the heart of his inner circle was Meyer Lansky, the quiet architect who preferred ledgers to gunfire. Lansky and Luciano shared something no other mobsters had at the time: a strategic mind. Together they saw the future of organized crime long before anyone else dared to imagine it. Where others saw ethnic boundaries, they saw opportunities. Where others saw threats, they saw leverage. Lansky didn't need to carry a gun. His intelligence was sharper than any bullet. He calculated risks with cold precision, turning potential disasters into profitable ventures. He could look at a chaotic turf war and outline a business plan within minutes. Luciano trusted him implicitly, not because Lansky was loyal but because he was indispensable. Then there was Bugsy Siegel, the opposite of Lansky in almost every way. Charismatic, impulsive, and explosively violent, Bugsy was the kind of man who made enemies before breakfast and allies by lunchtime. But his ferocity was a weapon Lucky wielded skillfully. Siegel wasn't a diplomat, he was a deterrent. A storm in human form. When Lucky needed someone intimidated, threatened, or quietly erased, Bugsy was the blade in his hand. Their bond went beyond business. It was forged in the streets of their youth, sealed by shared struggles and shared ambitions. Bugsy was the brother he never had, the loyal soldier whose unpredictability made him both an asset and a liability. Frank Costello rounded out the trio. Smooth-talking, politically connected, and endlessly patient, Costello understood the upper world better than any gangster alive. While Luciano built the criminal empire from the alleys, Costello carved pathways into the halls of power. Senators, police chiefs, judges, he cultivated them like a gardener tending roses. Costello didn't intimidate, he influenced. He didn't threaten, he negotiated. His calm demeanor hid a razor-sharp cunning, and his ability to blend into high society made him the perfect diplomat for Luciano's growing empire. If Lansky was the brain and Siegel the muscle, Costello was the voice, the quiet whisper that moved mountains. But allies alone could not secure power. For every trusted friend, Luciano had a dozen enemies. Some were predictable. Others lurked behind friendly smiles. Joe, the boss, Masuria had been the first giant Luciano had to confront. Masuria represented the old world, greedy, arrogant, and violently entrenched in outdated Sicilian customs. He believed in absolute obedience and saw Lucky's cross-ethnic alliances as blasphemy. Masuria didn't just oppose Luciano, he resented him. To the old Don, Lucky was an upstart kid with too much ambition and not enough fear. But Masuria underestimated Luciano's intellect. He didn't realize that Lucky was quietly building alliances under his nose, turning Masuria's own lieutenants into his future business partners. When Luciano orchestrated Masuria's assassination, it wasn't an act of rebellion, it was a surgical strike. The removal of an obstacle. The first step in reshaping the criminal world. But Masuria's death only cleared half the board. Salvatore Maranzano, the Sicilian traditionalist who emerged from Brooklyn like a self-appointed emperor, was even more dangerous. He was intelligent, calculating, and ruthlessly disciplined. Unlike Masuria, he could see Luciano's potential, and that terrified him. Maranzano pretended to embrace Lucky, even offering him the title of number 2 in his new Mafia hierarchy. But every friendly gesture hid a plan to eliminate him. Maranzano saw himself as Caesar. Luciano saw him as a final link to the old world that needed to be severed. When Luciano's gunmen, disguised as federal agents, cut Maranzano down in his office, it signaled the true beginning of the modern Mafia. Even after those titans fell, enemies remained, some within Luciano's own ranks. Men like Vito Genovese watched him closely, learning, waiting. Genovese admired Lucky, but envy simmered beneath his admiration. He wanted the throne. He believed he was destined for it. While he served Luciano, he also plotted, calculated, and positioned himself for the day when power might shift. Luciano recognized Genovese's ambition, but he tolerated it, believing that keeping a dangerous man close was safer than leaving him in the shadows. Genovese was the kind of ally who could become an enemy without warning, and Lucky played him like a long, risky game of chess. Then there were the rival gangs. Dutch Schultz's violent empire, the unpredictable remnants of Irish street crews, and Jewish factions who refused Lansky's influence. Each one represented a moving piece on the board, each one capable of igniting a war. Luciano didn't aim to destroy all of them. He aimed to contain them. He used diplomacy where others used guns. He offered deals instead of ultimatums. He created a network of mutual benefit, where independent gangs could operate if they followed rules that kept the peace and protected profits. Those who cooperated prospered. Those who resisted faded into irrelevance, or into the morgue. But alliances came with price tags. Every relationship cost something: money, favors, information, trust. Luciano managed these costs like a strategist managing a budget. He distributed power carefully, ensuring no one ally became too strong, no enemy too weak to be predictable. He balanced friendships and rivalries with the skill of a conductor guiding an orchestra. Everything was deliberate. Everything was part of a larger design. And yet, even with his mastery of alliances, Luciano understood a brutal truth: power always invites betrayal. Behind every ally stood a shadow. Behind every partnership stood a knife. The underworld respected Lucky, admired him, feared him, but it also watched him. Men whispered in corners, wondered about his decisions, measured their own ambitions against his reach. Still, he remained unshaken. He knew the underworld was not built on trust. It was built on leverage. Whoever controlled leverage controlled everything. And Luciano, through his intelligence, his relationships, and his ability to read people, controlled more leverage than any man in the history of American crime. In this world of shifting loyalties, he didn't just navigate the political undercurrents, he shaped them. He dictated the rhythm of conflict, the tempo of cooperation, the limits of violence, and the rules of engagement. Allies, enemies, betrayers, friends, he understood them all because he understood human nature. Lucky Luciano didn't rise alone. He rose by mastering the art of others. And in doing so, he transformed the underworld into a world of his design. The newspapers of 1930s New York painted the city as a battleground for gangsters, roaring Tommy guns, car bombings, bodies in alleyways. But the truth was far more intricate. The real war was quieter, fought not with bullets but with influence, strategy, and manipulation so subtle the public never knew it existed. Lucky Luciano understood that open violence invited witnesses, investigations, and political pressure. But a shadow war? That left no fingerprints, no headlines, no memory. It was the kind of war only a mastermind could orchestrate, and it was the war Luciano mastered better than any man alive. Every corner of the city played a role. The docks, the union halls, the nightclubs, the hotels, they were all stages for invisible battles. At first glance, these places looked ordinary. Workers loading crates, musicians tuning instruments, bartenders drying glasses. But beneath the surface they were controlled by forces the average citizen never saw. A shipment arriving at the waterfront might appear mundane, yet its timing, route, and contents were all dictated by unseen conversations between Luciano's lieutenants and union figures he controlled. A nightclub might entertain hundreds in one night, yet its owner paid fees not to gangsters waving guns, but to suave men who blended so seamlessly into the crowd that no one realized they were there. Luciano ran New York like a chessboard, guarding the king while manipulating every pawn and knight in play. He placed informants in rival families, bribed key union leaders, and kept close tabs on every smuggler, bookmaker, and enforcer in Manhattan. But his information network was not built through fear alone. He cultivated loyalty through financial stability, through promises of opportunity, through respect that other mob bosses rarely showed their men. Information became the most valuable currency in the underworld, and Luciano controlled it with unbreakable discipline. The shadow war intensified with the threat of rival gangsters who sought to undermine the commission he had created. Dutch Schultz was one of the most volatile. Schultz didn't understand Luciano's vision of order. He preferred brute force, chaos, and intimidation. He threatened prosecutors publicly, drew unnecessary attention to his operations, and risked unraveling the delicate balance Lucky had constructed. Luciano's approach to managing Schultz was a masterclass in invisible warfare. He didn't strike immediately. He observed. He measured Schultz's influence. And when Schultz threatened to assassinate District Attorney Thomas Dewey, a reckless move that would plunge the entire underworld into a political firestorm, Luciano orchestrated his elimination not out of hatred but necessity. But the killing wasn't the war, the negotiation behind it was. Luciano convened the commission. He argued calmly, logically, that Schultz had become a liability. He didn't order the execution himself. He let the room decide. And when the commission voted to eliminate Schultz, the hit went forward not as a personal vendetta, but as a collective act of internal policing. Luciano had managed to maintain legitimacy even while orchestrating the death of one of the city's most feared criminals. This was the power of the shadow war, decisions made in silence that shaped the city's future. Yet Luciano's battles weren't only against rivals. Law enforcement was tightening its grip. District Attorney Thomas Dewey had become a rising star, a bulldog who refused to be intimidated or bribed. His campaign to expose organized crime electrified the city. Night after night, he appeared on radio broadcasts, warning listeners about the invisible network controlling New York streets. Dewey was ambitious, disciplined, and honest in a way that made him both admirable and dangerous. Most gangsters underestimated him. Luciano did not. He engaged Dewey from the shadows, never directly, always through intermediaries. He used political connections to slow investigations. He pressured allies within the police department to redirect raids. He manipulated public opinion by ensuring certain arrests or small-time convictions occurred at strategic moments. Dewey saw the tip of the iceberg. Luciano controlled the iceberg. The unions were another front in this invisible war. Whoever controlled the unions controlled the city's heartbeat. Strikes could cripple industries, delay shipments, or force companies to negotiate. Luciano didn't want chaos, he wanted leverage. By strategically placing his men in key union leadership roles, he ensured that every conflict served a purpose. If a rival mobster tried to move into his territory, Luciano could disrupt their supply lines without firing a shot. If a business owner resisted his demands, trucks got stuck in traffic, warehouses suddenly lost electricity, shipments mysteriously vanished at sea. These were battles fought without sound, without violence, without witnesses, yet they shaped the economic landscape of New York. Spycraft became another essential weapon in Luciano's arsenal. He placed watchers in hotels, train stations, restaurants, anywhere rivals might conduct quiet meetings. Sometimes these watchers were criminals. Other times they were waiters, janitors, bellhops, ordinary workers who saw everything and were paid handsomely to keep quiet. Luciano understood better than anyone how people moved through the city, where they hid, where they met, where they believed they were safe. And he used that knowledge with surgical precision. But the Shadow War was not only fought outward, it was fought inward as well. Members of Luciano's own family tested boundaries, sought more power, or formed secret alliances. Vito Genovese, always ambitious, always hungry, watched Lucky closely. He observed his methods, learned his strategies, studied his weaknesses. Genovese wasn't content to be a lieutenant, he wanted the throne. And while he played the loyal soldier, he whispered in corners, made connections in secret, and positioned himself for a future takeover. Luciano understood this but allowed Genovese to remain close, believing that an ambitious enemy was easier to predict when he sat at your dinner table. Meanwhile, Luciano cultivated political alliances the way a gardener tends flowers. Every handshake with a judge, every quiet meeting with a senator, every envelope passed discreetly to a police commissioner, they were all part of the Shadow War. These alliances weren't just about avoiding prosecution. They were about shaping the environment in which he and his empire operated. A delayed investigation here, a reassigned detective there, a lenient judge ruling at the perfect moment, it all accumulated into a protective shield around his operations. This influence reached far beyond New York. Luciano helped build networks in Chicago, Florida, Cuba, and even Europe. His Shadow War was international. He communicated through coded messages, trusted couriers, and secret meetings. The American Mafia under his leadership became a national force, coordinated, efficient, and invisible. Yet for all the power he accumulated, for all the wars he fought in silence, there was one thing Luciano could not control: time. The more successful he became, the more powerful his enemies grew. The longer he remained in the shadows, the more determined Dewey became to pull him into the light. And as tension built across the city, the quiet war Luciano had mastered began to change shape, growing sharper, louder, more dangerous. Every invisible victory had carried a cost. Every silent battle had left a mark. And soon, the shadows that once protected him would begin to fade. It didn't happen all at once. Men like Lucky Luciano rarely fall in a single moment. Their downfall begins quietly, almost invisibly, with small fractures spreading through the foundations they once believed were unshakable. 4 years, Luciano had walked through the underworld like a man blessed, untouchable, strategic, always 3 steps ahead of law enforcement, rivals, and even his own ambitious lieutenants. But the empire he built, as flawless as it seemed, was not invincible. Power, no matter how meticulously constructed, carries a weight. And eventually, that weight begins to press down. Luciano's first cracks appeared not on the streets, but in the newspapers. The public had always sensed the shadows behind New York's glittering skyline, but now they hungered for someone to blame. Crime had become too visible, too profitable, too organized. People wanted a name, a face, to attach their fears to. And few names carried the magnetic pull of Charles Lucky Luciano. Stories painted him as a phantom king running an invisible empire. Articles speculated about his wealth, his influence, his untouchable aura. It didn't matter that most of it was exaggerated, the narrative felt true. And in politics, public perception mattered more than reality. This shift in public appetite collided perfectly with the rise of an ambitious prosecutor named Thomas Dewey. Young, relentless, and determined to make a name for himself, Dewey saw Luciano not as a mobster but as a ladder. A chance to climb into political stardom. While the police had long accepted bribes and looked the other way, Dewey refused. He was incorruptible, almost annoyingly so. He didn't fear the Mafia. He didn't negotiate. He wanted blood, legal blood, and Luciano's would be the most valuable trophy of his career. At first, Luciano didn't take Dewey seriously. Prosecutors came and went, each claiming they would clean up the city, each eventually folding under pressure, bribery, or intimidation. Dewey seemed no different. But he was. He studied the Mafia like a scientist studying a virus. Mapping connections, tracking informants, charting financial flows. He tore through brothels, gambling dens, union offices, and warehouses, searching for cracks in Luciano's network. And slowly he found them. The brothels became the beginning of the end. For years, Luciano's prostitution operations had functioned smoothly and discreetly. But Dewey didn't investigate like the police. He broke down doors, arrested everyone in sight, and squeezed information from anyone vulnerable enough to talk. Women who had once feared the Mafia more than death suddenly found hope in Dewey's promises of protection. He treated them not as criminals but as witnesses. For the first time in their lives, someone offered them a way out. One woman after another whispered the same name. Luciano. 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 It didn't matter that he rarely had direct contact with the brothels. Dewey wasn't looking for proof of Luciano's physical presence. He was building a narrative, that Luciano controlled vice in New York, that he was the mastermind behind a massive prostitution network. The prosecutors didn't need him in the room, they just needed him in the hierarchy. Lucky's own men contributed to the growing cracks. Vito Genovese, long consumed by ambition, began to distance himself from Luciano, silently preparing for the moment power shifted. He whispered rumors, built alliances with those discontented, and kept a watchful eye on the prosecutor's progress. If Luciano fell, Genovese would be there to pick up the pieces. Then there were the small betrayals, informants whose loyalty crumbled under pressure, rivals who fed Dewey information, politicians who vanished the moment things grew dangerous. Luciano had bought influence for years, but influence was not loyalty. When a man sensed the winds changing, he protected himself first. Bribes that once secured silence now barely slowed the leak of information. Luciano also underestimated the political landscape. The nation was shifting. Moral crusaders, fueled by outrage over vice, pushed for legal victories. Churches delivered fiery sermons condemning organized crime. Newspapers demanded justice. The city had reached a tipping point, and Luciano's invisible hand was now too visible to ignore. The inevitable turning point came when Dewey launched a coordinated crackdown on the city's vice district. Raids struck simultaneously, ripping apart brothels, arresting madams, and dragging pimps into interrogation rooms. The operations Luciano had built with such precision suddenly looked fragile. Dewey's men interrogated hundreds, then thousands. Some broke. Some lied. Some simply wanted revenge. Every whisper added another brick to Dewey's case. Luciano felt the shift. He sensed the air growing heavier, the silence around him becoming sharper, more dangerous. Meetings grew shorter. Conversations more cautious. Even his closest allies began to watch him differently. Power attracts loyalty, vulnerability attracts ambition. Still, he believed he could outmaneuver Dewey. He believed no prosecutor could truly understand the complex machinery of the Mafia. But Dewey didn't need to understand it, he just needed to dismantle it piece by piece. And he did. One morning, Lucky woke to find that the shadow war he'd mastered no longer protected him. The walls were closing in. Investigators trailed him. Friends stopped calling. Politicians avoided him. For the first time in his career, Luciano felt the cold breath of danger brush the back of his neck. He tried to flee the city quietly, slipping into safe houses, consulting with Lansky, weighing his options. But every path led to the same outcome: confrontation. He was too famous, too recognizable, too essential to the story Dewey wanted to tell. The moment he was arrested, the world changed. The newspapers erupted with triumphant headlines. Photographers swarmed him like starving animals. The public celebrated as if a dictator had fallen. Men who had once sought his favor now rushed to distance themselves. It wasn't a verdict yet, but the presumption was clear. Luciano had already been judged. The cracks in his empire were no longer small. They were fractures, deep, jagged, unstoppable. Dewey's case gained momentum with every passing day. Witnesses multiplied. Evidence, real or exaggerated, stacked higher. Luciano's influence, once vast and suffocating, began to thin like smoke in the wind. Lucky Luciano had built an empire out of order. And now order had turned against him. The fall had begun, not with violence, but with the quiet tightening of a legal noose he never saw coming. The courtroom was not a battlefield of bullets or blood, but for Lucky Luciano, it felt far more dangerous. It was a battlefield he could not control, one where charm, strategy, and silent intimidation lost their power the moment he stepped inside. The oak doors, the polished floors, the solemn rows of benches filled with wide-eyed spectators, it all felt suffocating. This was not his world. This was Dewey's. A world ruled by procedure, evidence, and relentless moral outrage. And as Luciano sat at the defendant's table, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit that could not hide the strain beneath his composure, he understood that the true war for his freedom had begun. The trial was a spectacle long before the first witness took the stand. Reporters packed the hallways, scribbling every detail of Luciano's demeanor, the way he crossed his legs, the way he whispered to his lawyers, the expression in his eyes. Photographers snapped pictures relentlessly, freezing him in time as the face of American vice. Headlines screamed accusations even before testimony began. To the public he was already guilty. To the newspapers he was the embodiment of organized sin. And to Dewey he was the prize that would crown his crusade. Dewey stood in the spotlight, delivering opening statements with the confidence of a man holding the moral high ground. He painted Luciano not as a single actor, but as the mastermind of an empire of exploitation. He described a vast web of brothels, hundreds, he claimed, operated not by independent madams but by a coordinated system controlled from above. He spoke of money skimmed from desperate women, of fear used as currency, of violence that lurked behind velvet curtains. Every sentence was sharpened for impact, crafted to shock the courtroom. Luciano watched from his seat, stone-faced. He knew Dewey's narrative was exaggerated, but he also knew that the truth mattered less than the story the prosecutor could make people believe. Witness after witness took the stand. Women dragged from brothels during Dewey's raids, pimps who had turned informant to save themselves, small-time operators who trembled as they identified Luciano as the man who ultimately gave the orders. Some were telling the truth as they understood it. Others were repeating what they believed would keep them alive. Some were outright lying. But it didn't matter. Every word spoken under oath added weight to Dewey's case. Every tear shed by a witness tightened the noose. The defense argued that Luciano had nothing to do with prostitution. That he was being targeted because of his reputation, not because of evidence. They pointed out inconsistencies in testimonies, highlighted contradictions, reminded the jury that Luciano was never seen collecting money from brothels, never photographed with madams, never caught giving direct orders. But Dewey countered with the perfect argument. Men like Luciano didn't get their hands dirty. They orchestrated through whispers, through intermediaries, through fear that rippled unseen. And the jury listened. They listened because they wanted to believe the story. They wanted to believe that removing this man from the streets would cleanse their city of corruption. Luciano felt the atmosphere shift each day, felt the jury withdrawing behind walls of moral certainty. No amount of polished defense could compete with the emotional weight of Dewey's performance. The courtroom drama escalated further when Dewey introduced financial records, ledgers seized from brothels that allegedly traced money back to Luciano's associates. To Luciano, these connections were circumstantial, stretched thin by assumption. But to the jury they looked like a roadmap of guilt. Numbers don't lie, Dewey proclaimed. And the courtroom believed him. Luciano's composure began to crack, not outwardly but internally. He had faced assassins, gang wars, betrayals, and violent ambushes, yet the courtroom felt more dangerous than all of them combined. Bullets were predictable. Trials were not. In the underworld, every man had a price, a weakness, a fear. In a courtroom, the only currency was credibility, and Dewey had accumulated more than any prosecutor before him. The journalists fed off the drama, turning the trial into a national obsession. They described Luciano as cold, calculating, remorseless. They portrayed Dewey as a heroic warrior battling the darkest forces of society. It was good versus evil. Righteousness versus corruption. And the public loved it. Even those who doubted Luciano's guilt believed he deserved punishment for something. When the defense attempted to present character witnesses, they faced ridicule. Who would stand up for a man known as the boss of bosses? Who would risk their own reputation to save him? The silence in the courtroom answered for them. As the trial dragged on, the strain on Luciano intensified. His empire outside the courtroom began to feel shaky. Allies whispered behind closed doors. Rivals watched eagerly. Some wondered whether the commission should distance itself from him. Others wondered whether Dewey's crackdown might be the beginning of a new era where old kings fell and ambitious lieutenants rose. The moment that sealed Luciano's fate came not from evidence, but from emotion. A former prostitute, her voice trembling, described the terror she felt working under the system she believed Luciano controlled. She spoke of threats, beatings, and hopelessness. Whether her story was entirely true or shaped by fear, it didn't matter. The courtroom fell silent. A single tear rolling down her cheek carried more influence than any ledger. When Dewey delivered his closing argument, it was less a legal statement and more a sermon. He spoke of justice, of morality, of restoring decency to the city. He told the jury they had the chance to strike a blow against organized crime, to set an example for the country. Luciano watched, knowing the end had arrived. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, the verdict was inevitable. Guilty on 62 counts. Guilty of compulsory prostitution. Guilty of leading an empire of corruption. The judge delivered the sentence with deliberate severity, 30 to 50 years. A lifetime. Gasps filled the courtroom. Luciano did not flinch. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, eyes hard. But inside something cracked. Not fear. Not regret. Something deeper. The realization that the world he had controlled so completely had finally slipped from his grasp. As he was led away in handcuffs, cameras flashed like lightning. The king of the underworld was caged. Dewey had won. But even as the courtroom doors slammed behind him, Luciano knew one thing with absolute certainty. The game was not over. Not for him. Not yet. Prison was never meant for a man like Lucky Luciano. Not because he was above the law, but because confinement was the opposite of everything he had built his life upon. Luciano's empire thrived on motion. Men moving, money moving, information moving. Prison offered none of that. It was stone walls, steel bars, and the grinding monotony of routine. But Luciano had survived the brutal streets of Manhattan, survived kidnapping, survived the Castellamarese War, survived betrayals from men he once fed and clothed. Survival was his greatest skill. And behind bars he would use that skill more ruthlessly than ever before. From the moment he arrived at Dannemora, known among inmates as Little Siberia for its freezing temperatures and unforgiving conditions, Luciano understood that imprisonment was not just a punishment. It was a test. A test of his influence, his adaptability, his psychological resilience. He refused to show fear. He refused to bend. As guards marched him through the icy corridors, prisoners pressed against their cell bars to get a glimpse of the man newspapers had labeled the boss of bosses. To them, Luciano was a legend in chains. A symbol of power brought low by the law. Luciano walked past them with the quiet dignity of a man who still believed he was in control. He adjusted quickly to the daily rhythms of prison life, but he never truly blended in. He didn't have to. His reputation preceded him. Guards knew his name. Inmates whispered it. Some respected him. Others feared him. Many wanted something from him, a favor, a connection, a whisper of guidance. Lucky offered nothing freely, but he observed everything. He watched the prison's internal politics, the alliances between inmates, the corruption among guards, the quiet smuggling operations that moved contraband from block to block. The structure resembled a miniature version of the streets he once ruled. Within months, he understood the hierarchy better than those who had been inside for years. He did not seek power, but power found him. Men approached him for help with disputes. Some asked for protection. Others sought advice. Luciano rarely intervened directly, but he offered wisdom, small suggestions, subtle nudges, just enough to influence outcomes without raising suspicion. His presence alone settled arguments. Violence decreased around him. Order emerged where there had once been only chaos. Even inside a cage, Luciano brought structure. But the most remarkable part was how he continued to lead from afar. Although the state believed they had severed him from the underworld, Luciano's influence seeped through the cracks of the prison walls. Letters arrived coded in ways only his closest allies could decipher. Visitors delivered messages disguised as casual conversation. Guards, some bribed, others simply starstruck, looked the other way when Luciano needed privacy during visitation hours. Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky visited whenever they could, always careful, always discreet. The three men spoke softly, leaning close, discussing business as if they were simply old friends reminiscing about life outside. Yet every conversation contained instructions. Who to promote, who to demote, which ventures to expand, which alliances to strengthen. Luciano was no longer the visible face of the commission, but he remained its invisible heart. Outside the prison, the commission continued to honor his position. No major decision was made without considering what Luciano would have wanted. Some bosses insisted they understood his vision well enough to interpret it themselves. Others sought direct word from him. Either way, his philosophy guided them like a compass. The structure he created didn't crumble in his absence, it stabilized. Organized crime across America ran like a machine built on his blueprint. But for Luciano, prison was more than strategy. It was isolation. It was reflection. It was time, too much time, to confront what he had become. Days stretched endlessly. Nights were colder than the walls themselves. He read constantly, anything he could find, from newspapers to philosophy books. He exercised, trying to maintain the sharpness of his body because he knew the importance of presence, even in captivity. But the mental strain was heavier. He thought of the life outside, the life he had built carefully, intelligently, relentlessly. Now it continued without him. Some nights he wondered whether he had overreached, whether his empire had grown too visible, whether Dewey had beaten him fairly or simply outmaneuvered him with politics he could never influence. Yet he never indulged in self-pity. It wasn't in his nature. Instead, he turned inward, studying himself the same way he once studied his enemies. He tried to understand the choices that led him here, the betrayals he had tolerated, the trust he had placed in men who may have quietly celebrated his downfall. He sensed that Genovese had played a deeper role in the events leading to his conviction, fueling whispers, feeding Dewey information. But Luciano kept this suspicion buried. Time would reveal everything. Even behind bars, Luciano tried to maintain a sense of sophistication. He demanded clean clothes. He kept his hair combed. He walked with the same slow confidence he had on the streets. It wasn't vanity, it was psychological strategy. If he presented himself as defeated, others would treat him as defeated. If he presented himself as a leader, others would instinctively follow. Still, the isolation broke through at times. In rare moments, when the lights dimmed and the cell block quieted, he felt the cold weight of his own thoughts pressing into him. He wondered if he would die in prison. He wondered if he would ever walk the streets again. He wondered what legacy he would leave if this was where his story ended. But fate had other plans. For all the walls built around him, for all the bars locked in his face, Luciano was not forgotten by the outside world. A global conflict was brewing, one that would shake nations, redefine loyalties, and blur the line between criminals and patriots. World War II cast a long shadow across the world, and soon that shadow would stretch all the way to Luciano's cell. In the silence of his prison nights, Lucky could not have known that his next chapter would pull him into a conflict far greater than the streets he once commanded. His empire was still alive. His influence was still felt. And somewhere beyond the stone walls, the world was preparing to need him again. By the early 1940s, the world had shifted into a darkness far greater than anything the American underworld had ever seen. Nations were collapsing, soldiers were dying on foreign shores, and the Atlantic coastlines became vulnerable gateways for enemy infiltration. Germany's U-boats prowled the waters like silent predators, sinking supply ships with ruthless efficiency. Fear spread through the American public, fear of spies, saboteurs, and unseen threats lurking beneath the waves. And as the U.S. government scrambled to understand the scale of the danger, one question rose above the rest. How do you protect America's ports when the enemy hides in plain sight? It was in this moment of crisis that the government turned unexpectedly toward an imprisoned mob boss. Lucky Luciano, caged inside a cold cell, was about to be pulled back into relevance by forces far beyond the Mafia's control. The military needed intelligence. The Navy needed cooperation. The country needed protection. And the underworld, specifically the one Luciano once commanded, held the keys. German operatives had infiltrated eastern ports using fishermen, dockworkers, and obscure contacts who blended seamlessly into the busy waterfront. Ships burned mysteriously. Sabotage was suspected. The Navy's investigators, unfamiliar with the intricate power structures of New York's dock communities, found themselves helpless. They didn't understand the language of the streets, the unspoken rules, the invisible networks. But they knew who did. Luciano's name surfaced quietly, whispered in closed-door meetings. No one wanted to admit they needed the help of a convicted criminal, let alone one labeled the king of organized vice. But politics bends to necessity. And necessity had become a national emergency. The approach was subtle. Government officials didn't march into the prison demanding cooperation. Instead, intermediaries visited Luciano under the guise of routine meetings. They hinted at port problems. They hinted at wartime risks. They gauged his reactions, tested his willingness. Luciano listened with a calm expression, but behind his eyes, the strategist flickered awake. He understood immediately what the government wanted: control of the docks. Not through law enforcement but through the men the Navy could never reach. Union bosses, stevedores, fishermen, smugglers, and local power brokers. These were Luciano's people. He didn't give an answer immediately. He knew this was his moment, a chance to regain leverage, to prove his influence hadn't faded, to negotiate his future. He could help America win the war, and in return he could win his freedom. But he had to play it perfectly. Too eager and he'd lose bargaining power. Too hesitant and the opportunity would vanish. Meanwhile, outside prison walls, the Mafia had already begun mobilizing informally. Meyer Lansky, still fiercely loyal, worked with Jewish dockworkers and longshoremen to keep German sympathizers away from the waterfront. The mob didn't want Nazis in their territory any more than the government did. And Lansky, pragmatic as ever, understood the political value of helping the war effort. Cooperation, he believed, could reshape public perception of their world. But Lansky's efforts weren't enough on their own. The government needed full access to the underworld's communication system. And that meant involving Lucky. When Navy Commander Charles Haffenden finally approached Luciano formally, the conversation was not confrontational. It was transactional, respectful even. Haffenden understood who Luciano was: not just a gangster but a man who built systems of influence. The Navy didn't need muscle. They needed organization, discipline, trust. Lucky could provide all three. Sitting in the warden's office, Luciano listened calmly as Haffenden explained the stakes. German submarines were crippling American supply lines. There was fear of sabotage on the docks. Thousands of lives could be lost if the ports weren't secured. Luciano nodded slowly. He understood the full weight of the moment. America was at war, and he had the power to influence that war from inside his cell. Power, he realized, was not confined by steel bars. The arrangements were made quietly. No official deal was put on paper. No statements were issued. The prison warden, certain officials, and a small circle of Navy operatives facilitated the connection. Luciano began communicating with the outside world through approved visitors, coded letters, and strategic meetings. His reach extended instantly. He summoned the union bosses who once answered to him. He summoned dock foremen. He summoned the Italian waterfront families who controlled access, loading schedules, and manpower. Every man who met with Luciano understood the unspoken command: protect the docks. Protect the ships. Keep German infiltrators away. The underworld never moved so quickly, so efficiently, so decisively. It was as if Luciano had never left the streets. Lansky served as the primary liaison, gathering intelligence and relaying instructions. He coordinated with union leaders to ensure vigilance. Patrols doubled. Suspicious workers vanished. Information traveled directly from gangsters to naval intelligence with a seamlessness no government agency could replicate. The Mafia's network, once a criminal weapon, now became a tool of national defense. The docks changed almost overnight. Fires stopped. Sabotage attempts dropped. Shady characters disappeared from the waterfront. The Navy credited improved patrols and new security measures. Those who knew better understood that Luciano's influence had sealed the cracks no law enforcement could reach. Word of Operation Underworld began to spread quietly among political elites. Some were outraged that the government would rely on a mob boss. Others saw it as a brilliant move. After all, in war, alliances are forged from necessity, not morality. Inside prison, Luciano felt something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. Each report of safer docks, each whisper of thwarted sabotage, reminded him that despite the chains on his wrists, his mind remained free. His system had value. His influence had power. For the first time since his arrest, he felt the tide shifting in his favor. The war effort continued, and Luciano's contributions remained hidden from the public. But within the government, his name gained a different kind of respect, a grudging acknowledgement of usefulness. He was still a criminal, but he was a criminal who had helped protect America when it mattered. As the war approached its end, conversations began quietly among state officials. The question resurfaced: What should be done with Luciano? Was his sentence still justified after the assistance he had provided? Should he remain behind bars after contributing to national security? The debate grew louder. Politicians argued. Judges considered. Reporters speculated. And eventually, despite the controversy, despite the moral debate, the final decision emerged like a whisper turning into a roar. Luciano's sentence would be commuted. Operation Underworld had not only protected America's ports. It had altered Luciano's fate. The man who once ruled the streets from the shadows had now helped defend a nation from the shadows. And soon he would walk free, into a world that had changed, a world that would never again bend as easily to his will. His next chapter would not be a return. Would be an exile. Exile was freedom in name only. When Luciano arrived in Italy after his sentence was commuted, he stepped into a country broken by war and far removed from the world he once ruled. Naples offered sunlight, crowds and curiosity but no real power. Still, men drifted toward him, young criminals seeking guidance, old associates seeking nostalgia. Luciano gave advice, but Italy was not America. Its criminal landscape was fragmented, unpredictable, and resistant to his influence. Cuba briefly revived him. In Havana, surrounded by casinos and American mobsters, he felt the spark of who he used to be. Meetings, plans, and whispered strategies returned. But pressure forced Cuba to expel him, sending him back into isolation. His final years were marked by quiet routines, reflective walks, and the awareness that his empire now lived only in memory. When he collapsed at the Naples airport in 1962, the legend ended far from the streets that had made him. Luciano's legacy lives not in monuments but in systems. The structure he built, the commission, the cross-ethnic alliances, the business-style approach to crime, became the blueprint for modern organized crime worldwide. Cartels, syndicates, and global networks still echo his methods, turning criminal chaos into calculated enterprise. Yet his legacy is a paradox. He brought order but also fueled decades of exploitation and violence. To admirers, he was a visionary. To his victims, he was a silent architect of suffering. Popular culture romanticized him, polishing the edges of a man whose life was far darker than legend suggests. In exile, he watched the underworld evolve into something more reckless than he intended. But even as new generations forgot his name, they unknowingly operated inside his design. Luciano died far from power, yet his influence endures, quiet, structural, and deeply woven into the shadows he once commanded.